on leadership, Discovering the Power of Leadership Metaphors for Development and Action, hosted by HRDQ-U and presented by David Horth and Chuck Palus. Today's webinar will last around 1 hour. If you have any questions, note you can always submit them in the chat box located on your dashboard. We will answer questions as they come in live at the end of the presentation or as a follow-up by email. My name is Sarah Schaefer, and I will moderate today's webinar. David Horth is an accomplished designer, facilitator, and executive coach. David is a senior fellow at the Center for Creative Leadership in the Design and Evaluation Center. He is considered a worldwide expert on organizational creativity. David is the co-author of The Leader's Edge, 6 Creative Competencies for Navigating Complex Challenge. Chuck Palus is also a senior fellow at Center for Creative Leadership. He is the author of Making Common Sense, Leadership as Meaning-Making in a Community of Practice, and as well, The Leader's Edge. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a nice introduction for us. Welcome to the webinar, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day. Chuck and I are going to get right into this work. You'll hear a bit about our history that led up to this work as we're doing the webinar. You want to say good morning, Chuck, as I get you moving into this webinar?
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and welcome. And so let me pick it right up. We're going to introduce you to this tool called Leadership Metaphor Explorer, as well as the background of using metaphors and visual imagery for leadership and leadership development. And the tool is the best way for us to illustrate this. And we're going to give you 2 experiences of using the tool today, one as an individual leader or working with individual leaders, and another example where we work in an organizational leadership context around strategy. So you'll get plenty of hands-on experience here. And just a couple things about the tool. It actually does work best face-to-face, no surprise. It's great for engaging conversations and dialogue. And, of course, it also works online. Like other things online, the presence of people being virtual can feel like there's a distance. But this changed when you're face-to-face, so just allow for that. And the other thing I'd like to say is that this is a very flexible tool. There's just no one right way to use it. And, in fact, our users are very creative in the ways they adapt this. So as you see this being used, feel free to think of different ways you can apply this to your situation. So let's get right into it. On the screen is an instruction of something to consider, a reflection question. So if you have a notebook handy, or you can just jot down a few of your thoughts, think about the way you are when you are at your best as a leader. And just make a few notes about that. When are you at your best as a leader, and what do you like? Now, we're going to go through some Leadership Metaphor Explore cards, not the whole deck, but a subset of those. And as they go past you on the screen, we'd like you to look at each one in turn and find one that helps you think about or describe yourself or answer this question. And that's the metaphoric leap, when you pick a card that helps you answer this question that you're looking at. And you'll notice there's a letter in the upper corner of the screen. And, for example, here's the first one. So as you see the card you like, just choose the letter and then write down your response in the chat box. And we'll talk about some of these responses. So I'm just going to be quiet a bit. And these will all be shown together on one slide at the end. So if you miss one and you feel the need to go back to it, you'll see these all together at the end. So let's just advance these. Think about the question, and when you find one, make some notes in the chat box.
And write the letter of the card. You don't have to write the whole metaphor alongside your comments or why you chose that card. See some answers coming in already, Chuck.
Yes.
See several people have chosen the circle of inclusion. couple of people have chosen a couple of other ones. I've just seen somebody choosing this one. Now we get to see all of them again. So you've got a those block, the letter and the of the card, and then why you chose that. You at your best as a leader. As I say, Chuck, the circle of inclusion has come up several times. People are talking about having a strong value around inclusion of others, that they work with co-workers, people who work for them, and so on. And indeed, working in other parts of the organization, that tends to be something that they found valuable and works well for them. They've got several comments that indicate that. I see that a couple of people have chosen my favorite one there, which is the co-creating musicians. Some of you may have recognized the Beatles there, and they've chosen that, and they see work as a harmonious activity. I think that's one of the comments that was made. A few others
weren't you
in
a
there
Beatle
as well.
once, David?
Co-creating musicians, yeah.
Yeah, weren't you a Beatle once?
Many years ago, right, yeah. And I see a couple of supportive teachers. They see themselves as coaches, and that's what they're at best when they're coaches. So some nice comments coming in. Just keep them coming in for a little while longer, and we'll capture those.
Great. And while you're doing that, let me just say a few more things as people finish up here. So I think you could see how this could be helpful to a conversation. That's the main idea. And in this case of looking at people as individual leaders, you could apply this in a one-on-one coaching situation. So we have lots of people that will walk into a coaching situation one-on-one and have this deck of cards at the ready and do this process and lay the cards out. There's 83 cards, 83 metaphors, and usually people have a lot of fun doing the assignments, looking at the cards. Of course, people choose more than one card often, and then that leads to a very rich conversation as people start sifting and sorting them and saying, oh, I like this one, but sometimes I'm like this. And so there's a lot of options depending on how much time you have to apply this. And then that same focus on the individual leader also applies in leadership development programs. Okay, so you might have a lot of individuals in a program, and the focus is on each person and their leadership and their leadership style. So you can think of this a bit as leadership style, and you can think of it often as how am I when I'm at my best, and you can even go into how am I when I'm not doing my best, or how would I like to be, according to my vision, where am I going in my leadership development. And so again, that could be an exercise in a leadership development program where you have individuals who are reflecting on their leadership and leadership development. So I see we've pretty much finished getting input. And
Chuck, one of the things I notice is a balance of very serious reflections. I mean, they're all serious, but there's some humor as well that it's coming in as well. For example, somebody's written a chosen card number D and said, I guess that myself and others I work with are out there. I guess referring to the flying object in the sky there. So there's some nice humor coming in as well as some serious comments, and of course they're all important.
Yeah, in our book,
in this dialogue.
In our book, we call that serious play, and actually we find that important in dialogue. But there's a very serious part of this, obviously, and then there's a playful part, and it's actually quite helpful to have this lighter aspect, playful, humorous. It just really helps get some depth in the topic. Niels Bohr once said, "This topic is so serious we can only joke about it." Right? So I think you get the point there that there's some things that just require a bit of levity, and that actually gets us into the question of, well, what are metaphors? So we've done a lot of thinking about metaphors and leadership development, and you can find them in our book, The Leader's Edge. Metaphors are not just a part of speech. A lot of people, when they first hear the word metaphor, they think that's something from English class. And really, it's a fundamental way that people think. So there's even some theory that metaphors are the basis by which we think. Metaphor and analogy. They're really cut from the same cloth. There's some great books on this out there. You might have encountered the two of the most famous investors, Lakoff and Johnson, Metaphors We Live By, and there's a newer one by Douglas Hofstadter, Analogy as the Fuel and Fire of Thinking. I love that. It's a great title, and it basically says, it's all analogy, it's all metaphor. We're always creating categories. We're always putting things in buckets. We're always comparing things. And the more you can encourage that, the more creative thinking, the more fundamental thinking you can get when you work with people. And so just some examples of that, and these are actually from Lakoff and Johnson. They point out that our speech is just full of metaphors, and we can't really talk without metaphors. So, for example, life is a journey. Time is a river. Love is all kinds of things. Love is war. Love is a journey. Love is a rose. Sports metaphors are common, and you'll find these in Leadership Metaphor Explorer. And then we get into the topic of leadership and organizations, and you can start talking about social organization as organisms or plants, managers or coaches, leadership as an art. Leaders can be described as pilots, as generals, as parents. Leadership itself could be compared to a journey, and on and on and on. It's endless. It's really endless. And so that brings us to the question of, well, what are leadership metaphors? And so the idea is that leadership is a really diverse category, and even as we speak and we look into the world and see people exercising leadership, it's just getting bigger every day. There's just more ways that people are exercising leadership. There's people are finding different leverage points, and this is important. In our work in leadership development, we find that it's very important to talk about and engage this variety, because otherwise people get stuck in narrow metaphors. They just think of leadership as making people do things, or as some sort of being in charge of something, and it's much broader. So really, when you're in the classroom, I know many of you are facilitators. There's really two ways to talk about leadership. There's theories. Of course, we all have theories that we work from, what leadership is. Then there's also the metaphors, and we think you need both. One helpful frame that you might consider is what we call the DAC framework, or the DAC framework. We use this a lot at the Center for Creative Leadership, and it defines leadership as anything that produces the outcomes of direction, alignment, and commitment. Anything. And so if it's really anything, then you need to think broadly. After all, what does produce direction or vision in a group? What does align people? And where does commitment come from? It's really vast, and we need to get our heads around a lot of different kinds of ways to do that. And that's what Leadership Metaphor Explorer does. So as we were looking for metaphors based on direction, alignment, and commitments, there's just a couple dimensions to keep in mind. First is that there's a singular way to look at leadership, and that's the leaders themselves as the individuals. And there's also a collective version of understanding leadership, and that's how leaders work together in the process of creating direction, alignment, and commitment. That's really people working together. So in the first type, we have the leader as coach, the leader as guide, tyrant, king, and queen, and on and on. And in the second version, we have collectives that form the metaphors for how to produce DAC. And that's also a big set of categories. You can think of squadrons and flocks and bands and mobs and gangs and teams and on and on and on. And the cards are built to address both the individual and the collectives. So, for example, we have the ones you've seen already, supportive teachers, world-class athletes, Silicon Valley of innovation, self-catalyzing renaissance, and on and on.
So we were often asked where this tool came from and what body of work led to it. Chuck and myself were engaged in some research in the late 90s, early 2000s, and one of our working metaphors, if you will, and one of the ways of, if you will, a definition of leadership was around making shared sense of complexity. And one of the ways of getting this across to people was to, in the form of some kind of visual representation of this. Was we had a wonderful colleague who was a cartoonist here at the Center for Creative Leadership, David Hills, and we asked him to actually come up with a response to this very words here, leadership in permanent white water, making shared sense of complexity. And he chose this as a way of showing not only the turbulence, but in some ways the chaotic sense-making that can happen when we're trying to create shared direction, alignment, and commitment, as Chuck has talked about, the outcomes of leadership. So one of the things that we talk about in terms of trying to talk about complexity and turbulence and so on was the word, or the part of a stem of the word, rupt, which you'll see that word in disrupt, interrupt, abrupt. And so there's something about, something discontinuous about complexity. And so we know if we take the way we've used this to define complexity, rapid, unpredictable, paradoxical, and tangled, we can get from the rapid nature of change and so on in this complexity, yielding to a new reality. And the way that happens is through metaphoric reasoning, using things like Leadership Metaphor Explorer, metaphors in general, visual imagery. Some of you have experienced, for example, Visual Explorer, which we gave a webinar a few months ago. And then the second thing about unpredictable nature of complexity yields to understanding. And how do we do that? That's through shared sense-making. And this tool and other tools that we've produced are about trying to get a dialogue around a shared complex challenge, if you will, so that we can collectively make sense of it. So the notion of using things like this as a mechanism for the stimulating deep dialogue, if you will. And the notion of paradoxical, that things aren't just what they seem. The notion of that in fact sometimes problems are there just to be solved, but they're actually polarities, and they will never be solved if they're treated as problems to be solved. And so we don't go into that in any depth here, but the notion of achieving new possibilities by the creativity that comes out of leveraging polarities, both and thinking, if you will. And then finally, the notion that everything is connected to everything else, and we somehow need to understand how that happens through transparency. And the way of doing that is about recognizing patterns. And one of the things that we talk about, going back to that metaphor of white water we showed before, in white water, one of the important skills is about reading the patterns in the water at every moment, because at every moment they change. And so as in leadership, we need to be able to recognize patterns. Again, visual thinking and metaphorical thinking helps us with recognizing patterns. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move from that individual look at and the use of this card to one where we're focusing not on us as individual leaders, but we're looking at ourselves as an organization or a community or indeed a team. When are you doing your best work together? And how are the outcomes of shared direction, alignment, and commitment created? And so what we want you to do is we're going to show you some more cards. And again, there'll be a letter associated with each card, and we'll show the block of them at the end. And we want you to, choose one of these and speak to how that actually is helping with the creation of leadership, creating the outcomes of shared direction, alignment, and commitment. So choose a card that describes what that's like in your organization, your community, or your team. So here are the 9 metaphors that we've got for you: community of practice, confluence of agendas, network of peers, visionary landscapes, uncoordinated limbs, high-performance engines, by-the-book commanders, resigned prisoners, and finally conflict smoother, or smoothers, if we're putting it into an organizational sense. So choose one of those, type the letter, and in the chat area type the letter and why you chose that as how you go about creating leadership, creating the shared outcomes of direction, alignment, and commitment.
You're going to step through those, David?
So here's the first one.
So some answers are coming in already, I see. There's a few people picking visionary landscapers, and some of the comments have to do with when we're at our best, we're thinking about the future. We're actually looking at the lay of the land. Someone says we are paying attention to the way things are and the way things could be. All very good insights. There's, let's see, there's another one or two coming up that have chosen network of peers. So the metaphor is of a network of people, and people are mentioning how when we're at our best, we're at different locations, we're around the world, and we also are connected. And there's some web that's connecting us. And you know, somebody pointed out how strong that web looks in that image there, and how strong the connections are. And yet it's just clear that they're sitting in different places. So that's a good one there.
One of the things I wanted to comment on here, Chuck, is you'll notice there are some metaphors here that you may feel that they've got a negative spin on them, if you will. And one of the things that we've done in this tool is to very deliberately choose ones that may not feel so positive. In fact, some of the ones that we might think of positive, others people might think of as being not so positive, for example. But we've done that for a reason, and one of the reasons is when we're using this, we ask people to think of not only how things are at their best, but often how things were in the past, or how things, what things we need to avoid if we are actually to make leadership work effectively in our organization. Hence, we show a few things where the leadership is not playing out as well as we'd like to in some ways. So that's one of the reasons why we've thrown in a few metaphors which may not be seen as so positive.
And of course, that's a difficult conversation, isn't it? Often, what are we like at our worst? We don't usually ask it that way, but the tool allows people to say, hey, we're not always great. Sometimes we're not at our best in our leadership. And, for example, we feel like resigned prisoners. There's a lot of people that feel like prisoners in this organization. Well, you know, that's a tough thing to say in public with your peers when you're just using language, and when you're totally serious, like Niels Bohr said, sometimes you can only joke about things. And it's, you know, it's not a joke, but it's, you know, it's something that you could kind of hold at a distance and talk about without, you know, feeling like it has a real sharp point on it, and that's very helpful. Okay, so good. Why don't we move along and talk about, let's talk about business strategy and leadership strategy. So you all know what business strategy is. You all do it in your organizations. But what is leadership strategy? Leadership strategy is the collectively held beliefs and behaviors that you need to drive the business strategy. And the fact is, a lot of organizations don't have what we call the leadership culture that they need to support their business strategy. So let's talk about the kinds of leadership culture that can be addressed using this tool, Leadership Metaphor Explorer. Actually, they're built into the tool. And the first kind of leadership culture we talk about is called dependent leadership. And that's just simply the beliefs and behaviors associated with the idea that people in authority are responsible for leadership, hence dependent leadership. And then the next stage or development beyond a dependent stage is what we call independent leadership. And that's when leadership emerges out of individual knowledge, expertise, and ambition. And then finally, there's a third stage called interdependent leadership. And that's when people understand leadership as a collective activity that's just beyond the beliefs and behaviors of one person, something that we share together. And so, as I said, the cards are correlated with these three stages. So here's three cards: by the book commanders, resigned prisoners, conflict smoother. Those are all associated with the dependent action logic. It's another way to say this, action logic. And then the independent ones are illustrated here by visionary landscapers, uncoordinated limbs, and high-performance engines. Notice each of these kind of stages is neither, you know, good nor bad. it just is, and you can have more negative-looking metaphors or more positive-looking ones. And then finally, there's interdependent, community of practice, confluence of agendas, network of peers. They all speak to the collective aspect of leadership. Now, notice there's a code hidden in the cards. You might have noticed it already, and it's contained in the color of the text labeling the card. So if you notice the ones in the bottom, they have red text. The ones in the middle, they have green text, and the ones at the top have blue. And that's kind of a rough correlation or code with the 3 stages. And typically, we actually don't talk about this color coding or the stages represented. It's something that the facilitators can kind of keep in mind or keep in their back pocket as people talk. Usually the more desirable forms of leadership are interdependent or independent, and usually the ones people are trying to avoid are the dependent. And so it's just a way of kind of marking the difference. And when we talk about leadership strategy, driving business strategy, this is the direction that typically people talk about. We're going from a more dependent organization, which has been mostly true in the past. A lot of organizations have been like this. A lot of cultures around the world are very dependent, and they recognize the value in becoming more independent in their thinking and then more interdependent in their thinking. And so this all points to new cultural capabilities. And this is actually what we use in organizations when we're talking about leadership development and leadership strategy. So this flows right in to leadership development or organization development. And so here's an example we used with one large organization. This was actually the instruction slide that we used. So we gave people this task. So, and this illustrates the use of the metaphor explorer cards. This is an exercise, essentially. So we asked them, when they had been talking about their business strategy, we said, okay, so what are the beliefs and behaviors that will help you drive the business strategy? And so in this particular organization, there were 3 boundaries, 3 social boundaries that they were talking about. So if you see those on the left in the rows. So one was across the clusters that they had in their organization, and another was with partner, we'll just call partner A, and another was with partner B. So they recognized that maybe they needed different kinds of leadership or different kinds of beliefs and behaviors that were appropriate to each of these boundaries that they were trying to span. And we asked them to think about their relationships now and how those relationships needed to be in the future so that they could execute their strategy. So here's the instructions we gave them. We said, okay, each of your small groups, we split them into small groups, each one create one chart. Pick your cards and debate and decide one card for each cell. So that's an interesting task. Everybody has chosen different cards, but they need to debate and decide on one card per cell. So that's an interesting exercise. And then we asked them to capture a few words that go along with the card. And so that's helping them make sense of things. And so this is a picture of the results. And you can see that they got into the task. And what they did was create a matrix of where they were and where they were going. And pretty cool. These charts stayed up in the room for the whole rest of their retreat. They were at a retreat that we were working with them. So the result of this exercise stayed up and was able to inform subsequent decisions they made about, okay, so how are we going to put this into action? How will we do this? And so they had a visual, verbal record of their discussions, a very powerful, valuable tool. And so here's another, just a picture of that. I want to draw your attention to the picture on the left side there. That's people actually choosing the cards. And that illustrates what I said earlier about face-to-face situation being really powerful for using this tool. And you can see here, first of all, people are working without a table in the middle. That's often a very good thing because it connects people better. You can see body language. You see people leaning in, and that's very helpful. To see the cards each other are choosing, you need to kind of lean in and get close to them. And all this is very helpful to a productive conversation. And here is one of the outputs that one of our colleagues used using a mind mapping piece of software. So taking the digital pictures of these cards, which, by the way, you're completely authorized and allowed to take photos of the cards, and they go nicely into a digital mapping tool. So this person actually recorded parts of the dialogue and mapped the metaphors according to the strategy. And so they had a record that they used for the subsequent retreats. So they took the input, the output from one retreat and used it for the input for another retreat. And here's yet another example. This is by the artist and graphic facilitator Bruce Fly. And I mentioned his name because he is the artist that produced the images that are on the cards, our colleague. And he also uses the images in his consulting and leadership development work. So here he created this very beautiful graphic facilitation image of where this organization is going. And it's kind of illustrated as a river. And you can even see here the Visual Explorer cards were also used, some of these images here of people in the boats and others, the zipper. They were also working in with a visual tool called Visual Explorer. And in fact, a lot of people combine Visual Explorer and Metaphor Explorer. They're two complementary ways of using images and metaphors to make sense of things. And people often find it very compelling. So here's another illustration of the tool in use. And if you look at this picture, you'll get a couple of clues as to where this was taken. And you might not have guessed, this is in Baghdad. And the tool was used in facilitating dialogue between the Department of Defense and the Department of State in Iraq as the U.S. was transitioning out of the role that it had played there for years. And the highest level leaders in both of those groups were discussing how they would coordinate their work together. And that's a difficult conversation. Those groups don't always work together really well. And we were working at the very highest level. And that gets to another question that people have. People ask us, I love the tool, but it's a little bit, it seems a little bit frivolous to me. You know, these drawings, they're a little cartoonish. And, you know, maybe they're perceived as not so serious. What do you think? And, you know, we say, well, we wondered about that too. But every time we've used it with a group of senior leaders, they actually appreciate what the cards are doing. It's not about the cartoons or the pictures. It's really about the conversation they're having. So this is true of any group, and this is true of Visual Explorer as well. Once these folks experience the conversation, they like it because really, you know, it's not asking them to focus on the drawings. It's asking them to focus on what they think about the beliefs and behaviors around leadership. And so there was just a very positive reception in the military and the State Department. So I think that says a lot. And we've also vetted these cards around the world. There's a young woman using the cards in a youth development group, very, very handy with youth development. Next slide, here's a monk in Thailand who's using one of our prototype versions. And this person probably does not speak English as a first language. And what we've found is that it actually works pretty well when people don't speak English very well, or sometimes not at all. And if they don't speak English at all, we say they ignore the labels and just focus on the pictures. And everybody can do that. And you know, even if they don't quite understand what the metaphor is in the picture, they are able to talk about it. We even have a French version if people are interested. And actually, another thing you can do is you can actually use white sticky tape and cover the labels. And if you want to translate it into the local language, people have done that. So what is Leadership Metaphor Explorer? We've been talking about it. It's 83 cards, such as you've been seeing, 83 different ones with illustrated metaphors around shared work and leadership. And it's used in all kinds of ways, and people are very creative in using it in different ways. It's sometimes used personally. Just one person gets the deck, and they use it for personal reflections. It's often used in coaching. Obviously, in leadership development events, it's a great workshop or leadership development program kind of tool. You can develop modules around it, and those are often very successful. It's helping people see the future, their potential, where they're going, and as we mentioned, it's a great part of doing leadership strategies with people across the organizations.
You know, one of the things I should say, Chuck, is the how is it used is covered by a manual, and we also have a blog that we continue to update and put examples of people using pictures, videos, stories of people using this tool for doing, you know, good leadership and leadership development work.
Very good. And finally, here's a photo of some young women who are using Visual Explorer, and so we'll just take this opportunity to remind you that the two tools are really connected. We talk about creative dialogue, and we have a number of tools for creative dialogue. The fact that they're based in cards is very helpful, different size cards. You see these people, again, they're leaning in, they're rubbing shoulder to shoulder. There's kind of an energy and excitement in the group. They're getting up, they're walking around, and you know how important that is after lunch, and just to get the energy going. And there's the links to our two blogs that talk about these two tools. And the first one is the Metaphor Explorer blog on our Leading Effectively site that's associated with CCL. And then there's the second one that's connected to that blog about Visual Explorer. And so if you're wondering about how to use these tools, we invite you to go to the blog, and we've just posted lots and lots of stories and examples of how people are using these for all kinds of audiences around the world. And if you get a chance to use the tool, we invite you to send us your stories too, and we can post those in our blog and even have you as a guest author if you like.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That was really great. And we actually do have some time for you to answer some of your questions. So attendees, if you could please send us your questions now. And while we wait for those questions to come in, let me tell you a little bit more about the program that is the foundation of today's session. And that would be the Leadership Metaphor. It's a dynamic training tool designed to stimulate wisdom and understanding about how leadership plays out in an organization. Designed by the Center for Creative Leadership, this hands-on game uses metaphorical images and captions to open a dialogue about the 3 stages of dependent, independent, and interdependent leadership cultures. Okay, perfect. And it looks like we actually do have a number of sessions coming in, so why don't we go ahead and get that started. Our first question comes from Jane, and she wants to know, does CCL use your other set of cards, the ones in the photos, drawings, etc., for similar types of exercises?
You want to take that one, Chuck?
Yes. All these tools are related, and we've learned the power of what we call putting something in the middle. That's a phrase, actually, that people we work with tend to remember and tend to like. So you can create dialogue, it turns out, by putting something in the middle. And what do we mean by something? We mean something you can hold, something you can look at. Visual imagery is great. Drawings are great. That's why we think graphic facilitation works well. That's why we think using photographs works well. And so we put these on cards because the cards are portable. They go through airport security very well. They're light. They're portable. And so a lot of people that use our tools, including Metaphor Explorer and Visual Explorer, have a collection of these card decks, you know, in their back pocket, so to speak. So either they're part of a plan design, but often they're impromptu. And so when people get stuck, or you know, you're working with a group and they just need something to get them out of their stuck places, putting a deck of images on the table and asking them some of these questions is a very powerful way to get them unstuck.
Chuck, I was just reminded, not in a kind of a group setting, but I was working with a CEO of a company here in North Carolina a couple of years ago, and I pulled out the deck and put it in front of him and said, so tell me what was this place, what was leadership like in this organization before you came to this organization? And then where is it now? Where would you like to see it in the future? And he ended up by pulling out 5 cards. He wanted to talk about, the distant past, the more recent past, the current, and then a step on the road to what he saw being the ideal. And he picked out 5 different cards and told the story of that. It became quite a powerful story of his own contribution, as well as what he had picked up and inherited, and his own desires for shifting the culture of the organization. In this particular case, he was looking for the organization to become a more innovative organization in the midst of some of the turbulence that the industry was experiencing.
Okay, perfect. And the next one coming in, this one is from Bill, and this is an interesting one. He says, some of the cards evoke quite negative feelings. Do people actually choose these if they are in a group with their leaders who might be offended to be described in such negative terms?
Yeah, we mentioned that briefly during the session here, and often what we'll do is I've done this with about 1,000 people at one point, where I wanted them, and I had obviously several of these decks, and I wanted them to think about us as an organization in the past or at our worst, and then picking another card of us at our best. And often that's when the negative cards come out. It's something that is hard to describe sometimes, and you'll notice that there are some would very much feel like they've got a negative spin to them. You saw some of them in the webinar here, and often that's talking about a place that they used to be and want to move away from that, or have moved away from that, and want to work to a more desirable place. So there's this notion of using these card decks as a way of kind of seeing a gap between where we are or where we were and where we would like to be, and what the work is. The conversation then comes: how do we get from where we were, where we are now, and into that more desirable future place? And so that past can often have a negative spin. In fact, some of the cards that you would think of as having a positive spin, we've seen people actually even give those, interpret those as a way of leadership not working all that effectively.
Okay.
Nice question.
Okay, all right. The next one coming in, this one is from Mike, and he asks, does the LME tool work in different cultures around the globe?
Yeah, it does pretty well. Obviously, you have to be a little bit mindful of where you are, and we recommend people test this a little bit. So if if you arrive in a country you've not been to before, just try it out with some people informally and test it a little bit. What we've found is that it works pretty well. As I mentioned before, if people speak English, then the labels are accessible to them. If they don't speak English or it's a second language, then they rely on the pictures. And truthfully, we've found Visual Explorer to be a really wonderful bridge of cultures, and actually it works quite well to bridge cultures. So if I was actually in a situation in which I was worried about that, I would actually use Visual Explorer, and recognizing that the labels are in English on Metaphor Explorer, and there's really not much you can do about that, except you can get creative and, like I said, put a piece of white tape over the labels, and then actually write in the language that you're encountering what the translation would be.
One of the things, Chuck, about this as well is when we were doing our initial testing of these metaphors, we went internationally to ask people, how they might be, give us some positive, negative, whatever, metaphors for talking about leadership in your part of the world. So that was, for example, and I noticed it in a couple of the slides there, there's one that's well diggers. You'll see that as one of the cards, and that actually came from Africa. We drop cards that may not translate, although there might be archetypes with a different name. We had one of our cards was the Lone Ranger, and people said, well, that's American metaphor. Actually, there's probably a metaphor. There's a meta-metaphor, which is, you'll find the Lone Ranger exists in one form or another in many, many cultures of the world. And we are aware that some metaphors just don't translate. I know when we created the French version of this deck, there were some metaphors that just didn't translate, and so that they were either changed or reinterpreted for a French-speaking audience. But you've also got this device, as Chuck said, of actually not relying on the words and just relying on the images, or creating new metaphors by blanking out the metaphor statements.
Okay, wonderful. And it looks like our fourth question coming in, this one is from Ted, and he asks, how much facilitation is required?
I'll have a crack at that, because the reason we're silent is actually very little. It's one of these things we found. People, obviously people like coaches and facilitators in general will probably very easily get this. The manual helps, of course, but we've had people who are in leadership roles, management roles, who have been able to just use this in conversation with their folks. There's something very captivating about a metaphors that are quite accessible to people, and there's very little fear factor that we've come across for people who aren't even trained facilitators to just pick these up and try a few things. One of the things that we always say to people, and if you are one of those people who decides to get yourself a copy of Leadership Metaphor Explorer, Chuck and I have amazing after-sales service. If you actually get in touch with us, we're always helpful. We're always like to help you talk through your first use of this, exchange emails with us. But if, the facilitator's guide usually is enough. You get to do the first couple of pages and you get it, basically. And even if you just watch this session as a recording, it'll give you enough tips for you to be able to go out and use it in various ways and then grow how you use it over time.
Okay, great. Thank you. And it looks like we do have time for just one more question. And this one comes from Maria, and I'm actually intrigued about this one too. She wants to know, how did you create or choose the metaphors and images?
Yeah, I'll take that, David, and you can elaborate. But it's been a process over time, actually. We've been thinking about metaphors of leadership for a long time, and as David pointed out, the leadership in permanent whitewater was one that we were considering early on and got us thinking about different uses of this. And we actually were in a program where we were using a tool in which we had metaphors for leadership, but without the illustrations. And it was very helpful for people, as we said, to think of different metaphors for leadership to get them kind of unstuck. And yet it seemed like something was missing, and we said, aha, what if we illustrated the metaphors? And our experiments said that worked very well. And so then we began a more deliberate process of saying, okay, what are the range of metaphors out there in use? And so we used a variety of sources and, looked at different ways people talked about leadership and got some feedback and talked to people from different cultures, and through kind of this round-robin approach developed the set. And then a key step was actually using this model of dependent, independent, and interdependent. So we said, okay, so if we realize that leadership has these three forms, do we have metaphors that really represent the three? And we had to do a little bit of adjustment and make sure we actually had enough dependent metaphors and enough interdependent metaphors, because actually the predominant way of viewing leadership is as independent, as David said, from the point of view of the Lone Ranger or the hero as leadership, as leader. And so, we had to stretch a little bit and make sure we were covering the less intuitive versions of interdependence, and dependent is pretty common, but we had to make sure that we represented that because, people do see dependent often as negative, And that's actually not the case. You know, dependent is a very useful action logic for leadership. And so rather than kind of leave it aside as, you know, something that people aren't so interested in, you know, we decided to really make sure it was developed in this tool so people can talk about it, because talking about it is one of the steps required to develop it.
Okay, well, I would like to thank David and Chuck for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you, Sarah. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Enjoy doing this with you, Sarah.
Yeah, that was great. And unfortunately, that is all the time we have. So we appreciate your time, and we hope you found today's webinar informative.